So I'll continue going on. Today, what time is it now? It's 5 past. We'll give people a few minutes to join still. But we're going right back to the basics of federation. So looking at what is a federation, how a university can save time, effort and money by participating in a federation. And not just the university, but other folk, service providers, federation operators, users, in fact, how everyone can have benefit from being part of the federation. How we protect the privacy and security of the end users, how we share and collaborate is enhanced globally through federations and through EduGain, the types of services that can be provided, and how the national perspective can influence the federation's purpose. So federations are built around what's important to the nation at the time of its being built. It will change over time, but it is influenced heavily by what's important to the participating organisations. So that's the first session. That will take us through until around 12:30. Then we're going to have a half-hour lunch break. We're going to run downstairs and get some food, and then run back up and then look at the federation operator and what the role the federation operator plays in the federation. Things like providing the framework for interoperability, so providing the technology that brings it all together, what they need to do when they're evaluating new member organisations who are joining their federation, some information about aggregating metadata, about identity providers and service providers. It's getting a little bit technical. I'll try to keep it fairly high level, but we eventually do need to get into the nuts and bolts. And then how to make sure that our federation operators are providing a sustainable service and some of the many other tasks that the federation operator will be involved in. But as I said, this is very much back to the beginning, back to basics. So those who are running a functioning federation might get a little bit bored, but hopefully they'll be participating and providing their input so others can learn from their knowledge and experience in this space. And they may also learn something new as we progress through the day. And then tomorrow we've got the third day, which we'll be looking in the morning. The first session will be talking about the iFIRExMAN project. And I believe, Farhan, you wanted the first half of that to be a closed session just for those who are coming to Singapore. Is that correct? Is Farhan still with us? I'm talking to somebody. No, he seems to have disappeared. Anyway, I believe the first half of tomorrow will be a closed session. Then we'll open it up probably about 11:45 for just a general discussion on the iFIRExMAN project. Then after that, a beginner's look at setting up EduRoam at the national federation level. And that'll be a learning experience for myself because I've never done that, so the blind leading the blind. So it should be fun. Okay.
I missed your comment, Terry, at the start. You're blind on what?
The blind will be leading the blind because I don't know much. I've never done an EduRoam setup. I've just read the doco. It's interesting documentation. It's pretty simple to follow.
Yeah, and more importantly, we keep forgetting about EduRoam because we seem to think that it's a solved problem in so many locations, but it's not actually.
Yep. I found a nice video that I might play tomorrow from ARNet saying that they'd done EduRoam and it's great, but it's still a lot of work to do. It's something I've been wanting to get more experience on, because we might eventually run a EduRoam in a box type service for our Federation members, or a hosted radius server. There's a few of them out there, I believe. Malaysia has one. I know that the EU or Jinan provides one, which we're actually using. It's quite nice. Okay, so we'll stop sharing that one and we'll jump into it. Oops. So I need to go to 6. So sharing my screen again. And we'll try for just move on to the screen. Swapping things about so I can see those. That's it. Okay, so let's get into it. Introduction to identity federations. What are these things that we're building and making available to our researchers, students, staff, and others who are interested in this space, giving better access to their resources, services, and data. So going back to the past, and I borrowed some of these slides from our friends at Jinan. And federation management is just the identity management, or part of identity management. And in the beginning, when computing first started, for many years, there was nothing of real value to speak of when it comes to identity management. Then applications started to grow, and the applications were built in such a way that all of the identity information about the users was held within the application. So when you logged into a service, in the old days, you'd be given your own username and password to that service, and it would be different for every service that you logged into. And there'd be different rules around the passwords, there'd be different rules around the usernames, so you'd end up having hundreds of different usernames and hundreds of different passwords to log into services. People saw that was bad, so they built these things called directories or centralized stores, credential stores, to store identity information about their users. And they rebuilt their applications to use these centralized identity stores so that users would start to have the same username and same password to access their applications. And the identity information started to move away from being within the application itself, particularly the credentials, the usernames and passwords pulled out, popped into these centralized directories, and oops, Charlie's been disconnected from Hoover. Hopefully others haven't, but anyway, the idea was that the identity information was put into these directories, and some of your personal information was held in these directories, and the applications could query these directories to get information about yourself and verify your credentials. Moving on from there, we go to this Iron Age type stuff. As I say, identity was being more and more stored in these centralized identity stores, and applications only had the data that was specific for the needs that it had, making life a whole lot easier for the universities to manage credentials, manage your identity and what access you had, because it was all stored in a central place. They didn't have to go to 50, 60, 100 different systems to add you, to modify your access rights. They could do that all centrally. Beyond that, where we are now, we have this federated identity situation where the whole of the identity has been moved out of the services, and the service never actually sees the username or password. It's completely hidden from the service, and it's the data about the users is held in some other store, a federated store, and it can be shared across organisational boundaries across the globe. So I can log into a service that my organisation knows pretty much nothing about if it's part of the federation, but my identity information is held securely within my organisation. Only the information that is required to run that service is passed over to the service after I've successfully logged in at my home organisation. So there's been a lot of maturity, a lot of development, a lot of growth, a lot of understanding on how identity and federated identity works, and it continues to grow. We're continuing to come up with new and better ways to manage how people access stuff. We are now moving to an even brighter stage, or a better stage, where it's not just your credentials that are held, but information about your authorization is also starting to move out of your universities into federated space, which is an interesting task in itself, because generally universities have information about your group membership, your affiliation that's specific to them, and it doesn't scale well across multiple organizations. So other techniques around building virtual communities, virtual organizations that have their own information beyond what the universities or your IDPs hold are being built as we speak. But that will come. We'll talk about that probably in the fall. We'll start to unpack some of that new technology, new thinking that's happening in the federated identity space. So let's go back to campus.
Can I interrupt for a tiny little bit, Terry?
Happy to have anyone interrupt and jump in any time.
Yeah, so Terry put on a good point there. And so actually in this Iron Age period that we actually did something which was a little bit bad for our users. We exposed them to man-in-the-middle attacks by having all of this central credentials. Every app used the same thing on campus. And that was okay on campus, because campuses once upon a time had lots of apps. But users want to make their experience easy for themselves, so they use the same credentials in lots of other locations, right? And this is unfortunately bad, because they type in the same username and password into any login box that's ever thrown at them. And so we created a problem there, and then we spent a long time on the security side of things trying to convince people not to do this. We solved it a little bit in the Diamond Age by limiting a single location that you would ever type in your username and passwords. And actually, we're now doing more work in this space to try and get people to improve the authentication using two-factor and other things in this one location to stop you having further problems. But this is but what you'll notice as you move along this development cycle in your own environments, either at your NREN level or your campus level, is you move away from an application only, and you solve this authorization problem, and you now create a group management problem. As you improve one area, it becomes evident that you've now created another problem for yourself. it's solvable. It's not the end of the world, but you should realize that this is the way IT works. Once you solve one problem, the next most important problem now becomes visible to you.
Yeah. Okay. So campus level identity management. So identity starts at your university campus and your research institutions. That's where users live, users work, users study, and they do their research there. Staff and students and researchers join the university community for these things. They go to university to learn, basically. And the university or the institution will capture some personal information about the individuals and store it in the HR system, the student system, the research systems, the learning management systems, and so forth. And they will also generally issue a user ID or username or an identifier and some password or PIN, and the more advanced universities will start issuing multi-factor tokens that either live on a mobile app. I have about 4 or 5 of them on my mobile phone, or they'll provide some sort of security token. I've got one on my keychain. I've got this old YubiKey that I got at a TNC conference in Portugal, I think. They were giving them out. And there's other methods of providing multi-factor authentication. So on campus, they are issuing the credentials, they are storing information about the people who are part of the university, and it's all good. Most institutions will have some sort of process and tools that will take this information and move it about so that it will enable access to various systems. And these systems are generally called provisioning systems. They take personal information out of the HR and the student information system, use that to create credentials, create email addresses and aliases, and set up authorization systems for various services. So they'll authorize students to access the learning management system and probably restrict it to the course content that their particular course enrollment will allow them to access. So they won't be able to, they may not be able to see all of the learning management or learning material for the whole university. They only see stuff specific to their current course. It will allow them to access systems via wireless. It will provide some online storage possibly. It gives them access to collaboration tools, calendars, all sorts of things, and many other campus services. And some places even have their provisioning system provision up physical access via swipe card access to doors and gates and parking lots and so forth. So the provisioning system, it's a campus thing, but it's a very important part of an identity management situation. And there are plenty of options for provisioning services, provisioning systems. Back in my youth, when I first started working at the Queensland University of Technology, Institute of Technology at the time, I was involved in building our own homegrown system for provisioning, taking information from our HR and student systems and pushing it to directory services and physical card swipe systems. After a while, that was seen to be very inefficient. The commercial offerings were starting to come out, making these tools much more easy to develop or to maintain and manage because somebody else was doing all the hard work. So there's many out there now. There's the Microsoft's MIM and FIM systems, SailPoint's provisioning tool, WSO2, ForgeRock, Okta. There's many options there. And there are even a number of open source solutions. OpenIAM, which is what the old Sun identity management system. Midpoint, which is where a lot of the old Sun developers went to work, and they've now developed an open source solution called Midpoint. And our friends at Internet 2, or In Common, actually recommend the use of Midpoint and provide a lot of training on how to configure a Midpoint server to do the provisioning of taking information about people from a source system into a directory server or into an application. There are others, things like Glue and Free IPA, all do these same sort of tasks of moving user information out in and out of various systems. So the role of the provisioning systems goes beyond just the creation of accounts. The provisioning system, which is part of a larger identity and access management framework, will try to ensure that users have the right access to the right services at the right time. So as a person moves through their life at a university, their roles will change, their level of access will change, and eventually they'll potentially leave the university, and all of that access should be terminated or at least restricted to alumni type status. It will attempt to implement access policies. So there's a lot of policy work involved in running a provisioning system. It will try and ensure license agreements are met. So if you're licensed to access, if your faculty of law is licensed to access a particular service, then the provisioning system should ensure that only the people in that faculty have that access. And it should reduce the support costs because of automation and self-service account management. You shouldn't be getting too many support tickets at your universities because of issues in the provisioning system. That then leads us on to the single sign-on. So once provisioning is sorted out, most institutions will move on to single sign-on as their next major task. And as Brooke was saying, once you've solved one problem, there's another problem just lining up to be solved. So single sign-on generally is the next cab off the rank to be addressed. And here we're trying to set up for one credential to access many services. There's many benefits to single sign-on. Institutions need to issue only one set of credentials, so there's not continual queues of people trying to get their usernames and passwords issued. It enables users to remember fewer credentials, using less brain space to remember hundreds of credentials, or having to write them on sticky notes and stick them all over their computer screens or in books or whatever. It's just one username, one password. It streamlines the login process. If you've got real single sign-on happening, log in once in the morning, and that should be it for everything for the day, for your whole session. All your sessions should be automatically logged in. It reduces the chance of phishing. So you're going to a common place that you should know that is your login page. If someone's trying to phish you and trying to steal your credentials, you should see that fairly quickly, because the login page they're taking you will generally not look like your university login page. And as I said earlier, it reduces support desk tickets, so lots of benefits for everyone. And there are some risks that all can be mitigated. Authorization still needs to be addressed, so that provisioning still has a role in with single sign-on. Users may get locked out of many services if their authentication service is unavailable. So your single sign-on authentication service should be highly available. Unauthorized users gain access to more than one service. So if your credentials are stolen, then the theft of that credential can allow the person to access many services with that one credential. The multi-factor authentication is one of the approaches that have been set up to try and avoid that, or to reduce that risk. And the authentication service can become a single point of attack, so you need to put a lot of security stuff around your authentication service. You've only got one to worry about, not hundreds across multiple services. So most universities will have a look at the conveniences and weigh them up against the risks. And most, and I think all, will just eventually see that the convenience far outweighs the risks of running single sign-on. Then we now move on to enterprise identity and access management. So for users who have credentials which are used across services, and all is good, except users want access to more and more services. So the more you give people, the more they want. Many of these services are now cloud-based services, so outside of the domain of the university, and much time can be spent setting up integrations to these individual services. And this time is going to be provided by, or the resources will come out of your institutional IT folk or your library teams, setting up all these integrations to the many, many services. And there's going to be a lot of effort at the service provider end to set up those integrations to each and every university that they want to participate or have used their services. And some of these global services have thousands of universities connecting to them. So for them, doing an individual integration between the university, each university they want to collaborate or provide service to, doesn't scale at all well. So access is limited to users within the university, and it's not capable to easily collaborate with others across institutional boundaries. So at the moment, with this enterprise thing, it's the community within the university and trying to access more and more services. So there's another problem that we need to solve, and that's going to be solved by federation, and that's where we're at today. The federation is the natural progression of enterprise identity and access management to federated identity access management. But here we now need to have a level of trust, or a high level of trust, because we're trusting folk from outside of our normal domain of control within the university. So we'll just read this. Federated identity management amounts to having a common set of policies, practices, and protocols in place to manage the identity and trust into IT users and devices across organizations. So we're spreading the trust. The trust previously in the enterprise model was sort of built in by default because we trust our own employees, our teams, our organization. When we go outside to federated identity management, we have to build that trust. We have to grow that trust through policies, practices, and protocols that will enable the trusts to share users' credentials, share information between identity providers run by your university and service providers run outside of your university. So with this trust framework in place, tools in place and common protocols, users in one institution using the credentials issued by their institution can access services at another institution or company. So that's a great benefit to the users. They can access multiple things beyond the general domain of their university. So just having a look at the types of identity management or federated identity management options there are. For higher education, we seem to have two forms of federated identity management have emerged. We've got Eduroam, which is a federation providing wireless access, and that's pretty much all it does. It provides a way to connect to a wireless network so you can then access services from your laptop or mobile device when you're visiting a foreign university or a university which you're not a member of. That federation provides both identity providers and service providers. Service providers in this case are just the wireless access points, and they're spread across the globe, offering the Eduroam SID. And once that's seen, the wireless infrastructure does, or the radius infrastructure, does the magic of allowing the user to log in. That's a different federation to your identity federations, which is single sign-on for web-based applications. And here it's a different style of federation where the user's trying to access the service, the content, the data, the resource at the other end, at the service end, through the web. And in this model, information about the user is generally needed to enhance the ability to authorize that person to gain access to whatever it is they're trying to access. So for Eduroam, it's just a login, yes, no. With Federation, it's a login, yes, no, plus the provision of attributes about the person to enable their access. So Eduroam, we'll delve into this a bit more tomorrow. But it's an international Wi-Fi internet access roaming service for users in research, higher education and further education. It provides researchers, teachers and students network access when visiting an institution other than their own. And back in 2017, Eduroam recorded over 3.6 billion national authentications and more than 834 million international authentications. It's funded by a funded project funded by TN, saw the successful deployment of 7 countries in Asia with Eduroam, including Bhutan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nepal, Pakistan, Philippines, and Sri Lanka. And we'll have a look at how successful that has been. If those are still running, I think some of them are. Some of them may have got to a certain point and stopped, or some may have sort of just folded up altogether. That's something I'd like to investigate tomorrow when we sort of delve into the Eduroam space to see how that project is going, what the results of that project are going. Identity federations. This is research and education identity federations are generally operated by the NREN of each nation. It's not always the case. In Australia, the Australian Access Federation is not the NREN, ARNet is. So we have 2 organisations separate. We run the Identity Federation and ARNet runs the Eduroam Federation. Identity federations provide a policy framework that ensures the trust, and it provides a technology framework that implements the authentication standards. And at the moment, there are a couple of standards. SAML's the most popular one for identity federations, but OpenID Connect is starting to move more into the federated space with multiple identity providers talking to multiple service providers. Still some work needed in that space in the OpenID Connect to make that a reality. But there's also a lot of proxying happening to enable OpenID Connect services to connect to multiple institutions via SAML. Identity federations provide management and support, and they bring identity providers and service providers together. So that's a good thing. In doing so, the effort in integrating between an identity provider and a service provider is significantly reduced, because the identity provider only needs to connect to the federation. The service provider only needs to connect once to the same federation, and the mesh model automatically provisions or connects services to many identity providers in one go, and many identity providers to, and the service provider, and the identity provider to many services in one foul swoop. Saving lots of time and effort in integration effort by the IT or librarian type folk. It's another slide I've stolen from the Jinan folk. So identity management is the organisation process for identifying, authenticating and authorising individuals or groups of people to have access to services by associating users' rights and restrictions with established identities. So just some definitional stuff. So authentication is a process of confirming an identity. So that's done by a user knowing their credentials, a username and password, and having, in some cases, a second factor that they hold on to or have control to verify that it was really them who actually did the login. Whereas authorization, which isn't really dealt with well in federation space at the moment, but is coming along, is a process confirming the access right to specific services. So authorization is around access control. Authentication is around confirming an identity. Attributes. Attributes are just information about users. For example, we've got my name, my email address, my affiliation to a university, the name of the university that I'm working for or study at. There are plenty of different attributes that are passed between identity providers and service providers. So they identity attributes are used for identification. So when I logged into a service yesterday, I provided some attributes about myself, maybe my email address. Today I log into that same service. It knows me because my email address is the same as I logged into that service yesterday. It allows the service to do some authorization based on some of the values. So I said that my affiliation with the university, so the service might say, are you a student at that university? If so, you only get this set of access rights. But if you're a staff member, you can have more access to the service. You can actually update content on that service, whereas students might only be able to have read access to that service. And profile data, so how to personalize the content that's being provisioned or being provided to me. So instead of the service saying, hello, user from university, you say, hello, Terry, welcome to the service. I'm going to send you an email. You don't need to provide that because it's already been provided as an attribute from your identity provider. So we know how to email you, we know what to call you, we know what type of person you are. And we can then interact on a much more user-friendly and a better experience for the end user way. So federated identity generally has two parts that are split. We've got our identity provider. That is where the authentication happens. So this is where the proving that I am me occurs at the identity provider. I provide my credentials, my multi-factor authentication, and it is the piece of technology that will say yes. And the identity provider generally lives at the home organization or the organization that I am considering my organization where I work, study, or research. Separate to that are the service providers. The service providers consume the information from an authorization and make it available to the application. So the service provider hands off the identity proofing to the identity provider, and then will do some authorization based on the information provided back by that identity provider. And the relying party is just another term for service provider. So you've got the IDP, which is where the identity checking occurs, and the relying party that actually relies on that identity authentication occurring at the IDP. So collectively, IDPs and service providers are known as entities. And you'll hear me talk about entities further in the day. In an entity, it can be either an IDP or an SP or a relying party. Just all different terms that you'll come to know and understand as we move forward with this workshop. So federated identity. Federated identity management authentication takes place where the user is known, so my home university, and the IDP publishes authentication and identity information about its users once they've authenticated. Authorization happens on the service provider side, where the service provider consumes and relies on information provided by the IDP. Then it makes it available to the application that can as well authorize the user based on their profile, for example. So, yeah, that's what I've been saying. And now we have a new concept of metadata. And metadata provides the technical trust between the IDPs and the SPs. It's an XML file for SAML, and for SAML there are standards that define its layout and content, and we'll be looking at XML or the metadata in more detail this afternoon. But each entity has its own metadata, so each IDP has its own piece of metadata, and each service provider has its own piece of metadata. And they're shared by the federation so that each end of the federation knows the technical information about the other end and can effectively communicate across the network because of this shared metadata that is bouncing around all over the place. So using a federation or an identity federation, so what would it look like to an end user accessing a popular service in the AAF Cloud Store? I'm going to give you a quick demo of what that looks like as an end user. In this particular service provided by our NREN, it provides a file storage and file sharing capability. It provides the ability to run up a Jupyter notebook, which will then connect to the file store that's part of the Cloud Store. And it also allows me to define collections. So I'll have a bunch of files and I can say this is a collection of stuff, and that can then be used by a researcher to say, here's my collection, I'm going to now publish this collection of information out to some other store, which can be then used by other researchers. So let's try a real live demo and see what happens. Click on that. And I take it you can still see, you can now see Cloud Store. Okay, we can assume that you can still see Cloud Store, and I'm still connected to this particular window. So as a user, if I were to log into Cloud Store, I'm from Australia, so I'll click on the Australian link. Or if I was from New Zealand, I can click on the New Zealand link, and I will see all of the identity providers. So this service is provided by ARNet to Australian and New Zealand IDPs. My IDP is the Australian Access Federation Virtual Home. So I'll click on that. And this has now sent me to my organization and is asking me to log in. It's telling me I'm trying to log into this Cloud Store service. I'll click on the sign in. And now my IDP is telling me that it wants me to confirm or approve the release of personal information about myself back to Cloud Store. So it wants my common name, my affiliation and my staff, and I'm a student at the same time, yay, and my email address. So I'm going to let that have that. The authentication has now occurred. It's sent my profile information back to Cloud Store. And in here we can see I now have access to this particular service. I've got my file space, I've got activities, so this is my history. I can use this thing called File Sender to send files to people outside of Cloud Store. I can use this thing called Swan, and it will start a notebook for me. And now I'm actually firing up a notebook in some cloud somewhere in Australia. And now I have access to this Jupyter notebook, which lets me do data stuff, research type stuff. I'm not really that a foe with it, but it's also showing me that I've got access to various files in here. I shall kill that off. Shut down that session. I want to shut that down. Go back to there. So this is a really popular service. I've got some stats from the guys yesterday about how many users they've got. They've got somewhere in the order of nearly 100,000 users across Australia who have access to this particular service. It's a really popular service. It initially just had the cloud store part for sharing files, but now it's got the Swan part for actually doing data analytics on your data sets.
There's also, Terry, it's highly likely that Tane, through the Asi Connect project, is going to fund something similar to that, because that was listed in the targeted call for proposals and the NREN needs analysis. So hopefully there'll be the beginnings of a cloud store style service accessible to a wider range of NRENs and federations, because obviously that's limited to Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah.
And there's only 3 other territories that have access to a file sender like service. So that's hopefully that will come about over the next iteration. But yeah, trying to find, I think, was it Depthy who referenced, the need to search for killer apps. Sometimes the killer apps are lots and lots of smaller ones these days, if there isn't something that really gravitates people towards one single service, and you have to chip away at your wider audience with one new service at a time.
I'm also talking to the ARNet folk to see if they'll give us a more detailed description of what's actually inside of CloudStore, what the component pieces are, and how much it actually costs them to operate this service. Again, this is not a free, it's free for researchers to use, but somebody at the end of the day needs to pay for all the infrastructure.
And the file sender component of it is actually very, very cheap, because it only stores files for a short period of time while it distributes them to other people. And so the cost there is reasonably low, while obviously file storage keeps growing, and the Jupyter Lab, Jupyter Notebook work requires a compute service behind it. So increased usage costs money. Yeah.
They get pretty narky if you leave a server running for a couple of weeks.
Terry, can we have some cache access to something like this, something like you mentioned about this? And then when we can have this like a cache access to our to the admin, or maybe we can share with our community researcher to try, and then when they are agree, or they say that maybe we need, can we replicate this this one to other NREN?
Yeah, I'm not sure if ARNet will be keen to give guest access to folk, because they actually charge money for access to some people to access this service. There is a charging rate if you're using more than a certain amount of storage. But I'm trying to convince them, or to work with ARNet to provide more information about what's inside of ARNet's cloud store, what the component pieces are, and we'll probably set up some sort of demonstration video that you can take to your researchers and say, here, have a look at this video. Is this something that would be of interest to you as a researcher? So it's sort of a pre-canned, pre-cooked demonstration of it.
Okay, thank you.
I will, while you're there, Bazuki, I'll disclose the fact that I actually submitted a proposal to build a service like this for the targeted call for proposals. And so one of those things is to buy some servers for storage and compute, to locate them at some various research networks, And so far I've only approached Singaran and JUCC in Hong Kong, Harnet, to host that. But there would need to be a location to host the service. And whoever is successful in doing that project would have to do the same, I would presume. Though the goal would be to have it on net, on the Asia Connect network, so not run it in a cloud service, because then you're using people's commodity internet access to get access to those services rather than increasing the utilization of Asia Connect's peered network. ARNet were, yes, unwilling to offer guest access, only because the costs can sort of run out of control. And if they're doing it for Australian, New Zealand institutions, it's based on popularity will cause more file storage costs and more compute costs. So yeah, that proposal I think will be announced in the middle of September. So hopefully Asia Connect will have good news with some successful project in that space. Hopefully someone has decided to do the work, and that there'll be enough funding to cover those projects, because obviously it's a competitive round, so some projects won't get funded at all.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I mean, the case is, some specific user from the university, and then with their university email address or some successful with that's not really case. I mean, you cannot identify, and then you can have some limitation with the case. Yeah. So at least we can show to our research, okay, we have this facility, and then we can do this with some limitation about this.
I think it'd be good to actually get a real researcher to show them doing work with this tool and showing them actually doing some science or some research stuff. So we might try and arrange that for a presentation or a hand video for the next APAN.
Yeah, because right now if we're using the Jupyter notebook, something like we use the Google Cloud. Yeah, I mean collapse, and then collaboration with Google, and then we have some limitation, of course, for this.
And ARNet also charge their customers for access to ARNet services. So all the universities are paying ARNet. And this is just one of their many services. So I'm assuming that would be funding the maintenance and ongoing operation of this particular service.
Yeah, because one of the things that we will want to give to at least for the iFIRExMAN community, we will try to give some a virtual lab. Of course, when we give some facility for the virtual lab, especially for the student and researcher, then we have to know who is he and or she came from which university, and what is the limitation for their using some computation or some storage or some simulation. That's the idea of.
You don't want your virtual cloud to be used for mining Bitcoin.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Good questions. So identity federations, there's plenty out there. At the moment, there's at least 76 national federations, of which 13 are in the Asia Pacific region. There's different levels of maturity of each of these federations, different focuses. Some are supporting research, some are supporting access to publisher resources, some providing teaching and learning tools and infrastructure, and some are focusing on collaboration tools. There's different levels of support at each identity federation, some from a fraction of a effective full-time staff unit to 20+ staff members, which is the We've got a truckload of people working to maintain our federation. I feel for the smaller federations where there's only half a person trying to maintain this federation stuff, it's a lot of work for a part-time person to do. Then there's EduGain. EduGain is the inter-federation service. It connects identity federations globally.
Terry,
Yep.
just so you don't scare people off, the AAF does a range of other support, outreach, and other services. So the large staff population of the AAF actually goes into a lot of development and other work, which is not necessarily core to just running the Identity Federation.
Yep.
I'm not saying that those people aren't necessary. I'm saying that the AAF has, because it is a standalone organization and only provides an identity federation, it's invested in a lot of areas to add value to its membership and make sure people are aware of the value and the ongoing service of that. And so don't be scared that you have to find so many people to run an identity federation, but don't discount the fact that at a point in time, your federation will become popular enough that it can no longer be a fractional staff member, and it needs to have support within the whole organization as a service that you want to roll out.
Yep.
What Brooke said is true, because it's happened as well to Civil Information Access Federation. Sometimes there's not only for connection to the federation, but they want us to rebuild the entire organization IDMS. But of course, it's separate charges beside the federation membership, because it can be for some organization, it can be positive disruption, means that it changed the entire way how an organization doing the identity management system for their organization. It's a very good ripple effect, actually.
So when we first started the AAF, it was just myself and 2 other staff members working to build the federation from the ground up, doing all the development of the policy, development of the technology, doing the outreach to get members involved. So we've grown from that. We now also run the Orchid Consortium. We have a lot more outreach. We are building new tools to do authorization and group memberships type work. We have a team doing our own software development, about 6 people, to support all this stuff, because we've moved a lot of our gear into AWS to automate things. And we now have a project team. We've got funding for additional projects, so there'll be more and more people building stuff because they've seen the value in identity federations, and we've really pushed that through our outreach. I know Raj's federation, InFed, has also grown in number. When we first met, I think it was just himself and maybe another half person running it, and he's now up to 4, which is great. Even though he's sort of stagnated a bit, but we've got to grow to improve.
And also for InFed, for a very long time, it was a fractional staff member, not even, I don't know what the fraction was. It was a very background effort. And as a result, it didn't get liftoff for many years. It might have stayed for 4 or 5 years as just a background task. And so it wasn't actually until Raja joined the InfoLibnet team that the federation actually started to seriously grow and run a serious service. And so there is that bit. There is a bit where it can be fractional staff, but you need to have commitment from the organization.
Okay. So EduGain's the next step beyond identity federations. It's the federation of federations. And I'll come back to this afternoon. But in here, we've nearly 5,000 identity providers and over 3,500 services. And it continues to grow and it continues to improve. There's a lot of work happening to improve the quality of services and to improve the whole operation of EduGain. So it's getting better as we move forward. There's still a few things that need to be done. It still lacks a service catalogue, and I keep banging on about this to the EduGain folks. So we really need a nice service catalogue. There's inconsistent attribute release policies, but that's improving, and there's inconsistent discovery, which is trying to find your organisation to log into, and again, that's improving over time. And that's the end of that set of slides. Hurrah, it's the first time I've got 5 more to get through. So let's move to the next set. Okay. So there's one. Okay, so this is another experiment that I have with you guys. I'm not sure how well this is going to work, but we'll give it a crack. So this is about how we save time, money, and effort for the various cohorts that use the Federation. It's about the benefits of Federation. So firstly, there's a reduction in workload. Authentication related calls at Penn State University dropped by 85% after they installed their federated identity provider, Shibboleth. Provided current data, so studies of applications that maintain user data showed that the majority of data is out of date. Are you protecting your app with stale data? So having current data is very important for your service providers. Installation from service compromise. If data is pushed to services needed, and those services are compromised, the attacker can't get access to everybody's data. So it's improved security and minimized attack surface. So only the IDP needs to be able to connect, contact the user's data store. So it needs to access to the directory instead of multiple applications. All effort can be focused on securing one connection instead of one or more connections per service. So those are some of the benefits.
Can I talk about that attack surface issue, Terry? Yeah. I worked for, well, my most recent paid employer installed some software, some monitoring software on their identity provider. Well, not on their identity provider, on their data store, on their identity data store, so the directory. And noticed thousands and thousands of password, queries. And as such, in doing this, they overreacted, recalled people from conferences around the world to investigate this. And the first thing I asked was, are they successful password queries or unsuccessful password queries? Because clearly unsuccessful password queries are an attack. But successful password queries is just high volume usage. And they couldn't answer that because they didn't actually have good metrics or a good baseline for this service. It actually just turned out they didn't need to overreact. It was just lots and lots of queries. And they actually had 2 measurement things. One thing from one systems team said that our identity provider was doing receiving 3 queries a day, password queries. And I said, I think that's wrong because I've logged into more than 3 things today myself, and I know more than 3 people that have logged into federated services today. So that's wrong. And so because we ran an organization with, I think, maybe 120 odd people scattered around the world, lots and lots of password queries get generated from the different apps that we use, but all of those queries actually come from predominantly the identity provider, and reducing that attack surface and understanding what's happening with your systems is, it's important. It also means you can concentrate all of your security efforts, because you should be getting queries from things like your VPN, your Edge Roam Radius server, your identity provider, and you shouldn't be getting many queries from other services. And so realizing that, also because of the way federated authentication works, periodically you'll re-query that service almost transparently, depending on the speed of the service. You might get kicked out of a service, re-authenticate, and return without knowing. And so this will generate more password queries. But as Terry made the mention about refresh data, if you do need to close off someone's account, then all of their access will drop in quick succession. Or if there is a breach and you really do need to close down some accounts, that will happen quickly. And so it gives you a smaller area to focus your time and attention. So if you are a small team, it's ultimately less work to do.
Okay. So who benefits from federation? So students and researchers benefit by having more collaboration opportunities beyond the domain of their university, potentially have access to more resources and data, again from outside the university, and possibly access to student discounts if you set up a mechanism to provide the affiliation to companies that can utilise that to provide these discount services. The campus or institution benefits by having a solidly branded institutional identity, which improves the overall reputation of the organisation. A stronger security profile for the network, so they've only got one place for attack, so they can really strengthen that one. The ability to logically budget for the network based on actual data, so they can see based on usage what's happening, where the bottlenecks are, what's happening at the federation level, because it's all coming through to a single point, and they can monitor that. And they reduce the number of bilateral direct connections from organisations. Organisations can function under the common framework of the federation. The research communities benefit by more efficient utilisation of resources, so they're not wasting time creating accounts for their research communities or managing access control, that sort of stuff. There's easier research collaboration, can be set up within hours rather than days or weeks, so the processes of creating accounts is effectively reduced. And it's easier to share and move data between sites and nodes where relevant. So using things like Cloud Store or other data sharing tools that are part of the federation makes that ability to move your data about and share it much easier. There are also issues with that because you need to make sure it's being moved to the right person, and again, authorization and allowance to access various data sets needs to be controlled potentially. So for end users, they get single sign-on out of federation, they get improved security. There'll generally be some sort of self-service password reset, so it's easier for them to manage their identity and their credentials. And they also get international roaming through Edge Roam, if the university has configured up Edge Roam and is connected to the NREN's Edge Roam service. So that's one user community, just the end users, one group of folk. The next folk are the students. So I've just got a dot point here, and I was actually going to open it up to the floor to anyone who's in the floor. If you can just want to yell out or call out some benefit you see a student getting from being part of an identity federation, or their organisation being part of an identity federation. Now, if this doesn't go well, I'm just going to sort of skip through this. But if anyone's got any ideas about how potentially a student at a university within a federation can benefit, let's hear it now. There's some chats happening. Send it through via chat as well. If I hear deadly silence, we'll carry on because we're going to run out of time otherwise. Okay, no one's going to play the game, so we'll just carry on. Students, they get.
I was going to play the game.
No.
I was just saying that they can. They know that they can legitimately use and access a service, right? If they can log in. I mean, that's one of the big things is how do I use services that the university provides? And I think that some people don't know if the uni subscribes to something, and a federated authentication is a way of, if it works, then you're allowed in. And if it doesn't work, then something needs to happen. And that's usually the workflow for the way federated authentication works.
Students can also potentially get discounts, as I said earlier, if they are connected to some sort of their verification is being mined. They get single sign-on, they get all that sort of other general stuff that the users get. For researchers, any benefits that you see for researchers? And here it's more about communities of researchers across multiple organisations. We have a number of services which are very focused on research communities. Our Biocommons research community work together. They are building tools that will enable them to identify who's in that community and to be able to share resources securely and safely between that community. We've also got the astronomy community based around the Murchison Wide Field Array, which is part of the Square Kilometre Array project. And again, they've set up a system that allows researchers to access data from that facility using their university or identity provider credentials. The institutions, they save on having reduced configuration effort. They save on having less support to deal with multiple credentials because there's only one credential per user. They save on potential security breaches because there's only one point of attack and they're going to secure that nice and solidly, so there should be no issues there. There's probably a million other institutional benefits. And before I publish these slides, I'll fill in these dot points with actual examples so you can take this back to your own federations and say, here are all the
better usage metrics for the institution, right? To justify the expensive services they're giving you access to.
Yes, librarians love to be able to see the usage of the services, the publisher services they're utilising, and if they're not getting much usage, that service goes out and they can afford to purchase another one which might be of better value to the university. Your research communities, I've already spoken about those, ganging together to provide common access to various services that are of interest to themselves. Service providers benefit because they don't have to deal with creating credentials and issuing credentials and dealing with lost credentials and stolen passwords and so forth. A whole lot of work has been taken off their shoulders and landed with the universities who are doing that work anyway. They have less integration effort because they're connecting once to the federation, and that one connection will then connect them to all of the identity providers in the federation, so there's less effort there. What else have we got? They will have they'll be providing a better user experience if they're using a common discovery mechanism. I forget the name of it. there's a common global federation discovery service that's now on offer for service providers, and a lot of people are moving to that particular method to improve the user experience. And with a better user experience, more users will tend to go to the particular service. Merchants, these are the guys who are offering discounts to students. They get a bigger range of customers and potential customers, and can verify that they are really current students through a verification service. So they're not wasting money giving away discounts to ex-students or students who've only signed up for a week so they can get these discounts. They know that a student is a student at the time that the verification occurred. The federation operator, there's some benefits for being a federation operator, and it's another service that you can provide if you're an NREN. It improves your what am I looking for? It improves the types of service, the value that you're offering to your customers. So it's just another valuable service that you could put into your portfolio of offerings to your customers. And that's the end of that one. There's probably many, many other advantages to being part of a federation. Let's escape from that. Number 3. Protecting the privacy and security of our users. Some of this will get a bit repetitive, but this is a very quick one. So how do we protect the privacy and security of our users by being part of a federation? So federated identity, the first principles of federated identity is active protection of user information. Protect the user's credentials, so only the identity provider ever handles the credentials. It never goes through the service provider, so they're never actually going to be easily stolen by a rogue service provider because they never actually see them. Protection of users' identity information, including their identifiers. So for federations, the attribute release policies are very restrictive, particularly to the point of only allowing attributes for the use of that service that actually makes sense. If a service provider to come along and ask for each and every attribute available, then the federation operator should jump in and say, do you really need those? Can you verify or prove that you need all of those credentials or attributes about the user? So it's about minimizing the release of attributes to services to the minimum they need to operate their service effectively. And beyond that, some federations provide a mechanism for the user to approve the release of attributes to services. So if a user comes along and is asked to release everything about them, they might stop and say, that's not right, so I'm not going to release all that information. I won't use that service. I'll go and talk to my IT guys and say, is this really, really required? Protecting user privacy comes in 2 aspects. There's a technology and a policy aspect to it. The federation rules cover off on the policy side of things. Talk about supported protocols, and mechanisms, the attribute specifications, and how certificates are used. There's legal interoperability, so membership agreements, federation operated policies, requirements on identity management practices, and a bunch of other policies that you may choose to include or not. So privacy is actually built into the federation rules, but it's generally going to be based on your national policies and laws and guidelines. So for the AAF rules, we've got a data protection and privacy section in our rules, which basically states a subscriber, so it's an IDP or a service provider, when acting in its capacity as a subscriber to the AAF, will comply with any applicable legislation regarding data protection and privacy, including, without limitation, the privacy laws and data encryption laws. So That's one of our rules. If you don't do that, you'll be thrown out of the federation. In addition to that, we provide terms of services and privacy policies, and we recommend, and in some cases demand, that each service provider provides these particular documents. Here is an example of the ARDC, or Australian Research Data Commons, standard terms of service. And we've also got the AASO privacy policy. I won't look at those, but when you get the slides, you can click on those links and have a look to see what those terms of use statements actually say. And in there, I'm sure you'll find something about privacy and data protection. Privacy is also built into the Federation's technology. So any data in transit is always encrypted. So we always use HTTPS or LDAP-S or LDAP over TLS to ensure that there's no possibility of data being intercepted in transit. And encryption of user data within the authentication protocols is optional, but it's also recommended. And that removes the possibility that someone can steal unencrypted data transiting through a browser. It's difficult to do, but it can be done. But it's impossible to do if the data within the authentication protocol is also encrypted. We've also got attribute release policies that around the minimal disclosure principles. So only need enough data to provide to the service for the service to function. And the user informed consent of the data release. And we saw that earlier when I used CloudStor. It asked me if I was happy to release my email address and my name and other details about myself. And there is also a number of privacy preserving attributes. So persistent, unique, non-reassignable, and opaque. There are a number of those. Eduperson target ID, it's now deprecated. It's been deprecated for many years now, but it's still highly used. That's moving away to a new attribute called a pairwise ID. And if you're interested in having a look at the descriptions of the various attributes, there's a nice article, the shibboleth name identifiers, a description of the various characteristics of identifiers that you should be considering when providing attributes about users. Ensuring the user's security, again, multiple aspects about the security side of things. There's policy, people, and technology. We've got a fairly generic rule in that all our subscribers will observe good practice in relation to configuration, operation, and security of their systems. In addition, there's a metadata registration practice statement, which has information about security. And there's a security incident response trust framework that's been set up for Edge again to provide a mechanism for security information to be passed between the various entities that participate in the federations. There's also people ensuring security. So Edge again provides a dedicated security team that provides a central coordinating point for interfederation levels of security incident response, and it's supported by a security working group. And your federation operator should also be providing some level of security or people to look into security at your federation. And that's it for security stuff. It's now 12:30. So if we could stop the recording for the moment. Mr. APAN VR1. Do we have any questions before we get the recording stopped? Okay, so it's time for a half-hour break. I believe it's the right time. My calendar. Okay, so we'll be back. Hello?
Is there any representative from BDRAN here?
Did see some hands in the
Anyone from Bangladesh, right? No, no. Okay.
Hello, I'm from BDN and also
Yeah.
colleagues are represented in this session.
Okay. All right. Amita, could you please hang on. Where is her email? Okay, could you please ask Muhammad Ariful Islam to respond to our email? Amitash? Hello?
Yes.
Yes. So could you please help to relay my message to Muhammad Ariful? Because he hasn't registered for APNIC 54 for our upcoming face-to-face training.
Okay, sure. I will convey your message to Mr. Ariful Islam.
Okay, all right. And maybe just check whether he got the invitation letter as well. I'm afraid that it went to spam inbox.
Okay, sure.
All right, okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to head off for half an hour. We'll be back at 1 o'clock in Brisbane time, which is 11 o'clock in the conference time in China. So have a good lunch. We've got 30 minutes and we'll get back into it on my return.